De los Estados Unidos. Quiero agradecer a los organizadores de esta conferencia y gracias especialmente a la Universidad de Anahuac para hospedarnos hoy. Y gracias a ustedes por venir. I am going to speak in English today, so please do. Avísame si debo hablar más despacio, por favor. I'd like to start with a question that came up in a writing group we have at the Holocaust Museum. A question about what we often refer to in Holocaust studies as other victims. My colleague Jake Newsom is working on a book on the Nazi persecution of homosexuals, or more precisely, on the Nazi persecution of the practice of homosexuality, which was outlawed in the German criminal code by a piece of legislation known as Paragraph 175. Paragraph 175 predated the Nazi period, and it outlasted it. It was ultimately abolished in West Germany, for example, in 1969. The question he was grappling with, my colleague was grappling with, was whether there was a so-called gay genocide, or as some have phrased it, a Holocausto. And he had received advice from senior scholars on his dissertation committee that he had to take a stand, and that the stand was that there had not been a gay genocide. Part of the argument being that the case doesn't fit the definition of genocide enshrined in the Genocide Convention, acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. But fundamentally, the Nazi persecution of homosexuality was the persecution of a category of practice. But of course, the notion of the homosexual as an individual subject, born as such and worthy of protection from Paragraph 175, from criminalization, coalesced in the Kaiserreich in Weimar Germany among a community of people who identified themselves as such. Which is to say there's an ambivalence here between the persecution of homosexual practice and the victim's experience of this persecution as a homosexual. As a social scientist, an anthropologist who works on the quintessential other victim group, Roma, of course commonly referred to in Spanish as Gitanos, this is an intriguing question about taxonomy. What is genocide? And by extension, what is the Holocaust? Because of course the term genocide comes into being and is argued over and defined in a period in which homosexuals were still subject to incarceration. Some gay survivors of concentration camps were rearrested and re-imprisoned after their liberation, some transported directly from camps to prison. The question then of whether there was a gay genocide really is, did their persecution fit into the definition of an event retroactively established and defined during a period in which the victims could not have reasonably participated in the act of defining without risking the continuation of that self-same persecution. The question itself, I think, is actually oddly anachronistic, and I think it points us to larger issues in the sociology of knowledge in the study of the Holocaust that often go unaddressed. So in Holocaust studies, we tend to refer to Roma as other victims, sometimes we call them understudied victims. We often hear reference to their experience as the unknown Holocaust. And in fact, this is, I think, a peculiar epistemological structure in which what we know is that we don't know what happened to Roma. It doesn't actually much help us if we want to know more. Roma generally appear in the scholarship as adjunct, often as sort of collateral damage, and to the extent that we know what happened to them, it is usually a story told in reference to the mass murder of European Jews. In the case of Czech Roma, I work in the Czech Republic and its predecessor state, Czechoslovakia. In the case of Czech Roma, the story itself, the history of the persecution of Roma in the Nazi period, matches the central narrative of the Holocaust. Right? Identification, definition of other as other, discrimination written into the law, segregation. In this case, Romani Czechoslovaks had to carry internal anthropometric passports identifying their bearers as gypsies in interwar Czechoslovakia, and in that period also faced increasing criminalization and were intensely policed by the gendarmerie. In the Nazi period, they were arrested and transported to special concentration camps for Roma. They were then deported generally to Auschwitz, where they were interned in the so-called gypsy family camp in Birkenau. Most were killed in 1944 when the inhabitants of the camp were sent to the gas chambers on August 2nd. And third, most of the Czech Roma were annihilated in this process, and their community was decimated. Only about 500 or 600 people survived and returned from their internment. This is a story that we know well, in fact, at least as trajectory. And on the Czech side of the Czechoslovak case of the Romani history, there's plenty of archival documentation of the racial persecution of Roma, and this is the language that's contemporaneous to what we now call Holocaust. There are camp records from the two so-called gypsy camps in the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, from which a large portion of the population was deported to Auschwitz. There are trial records after the war in which Roma gave testimony about their persecution. If you look in the International Tracing Service Archive, for example, you'll find documentation of surviving Czech Roma seeking refugee status in order to emigrate. In the immediate aftermath of the war, later in the same archive, you'll find documentation from the 1960s and 1970s of Czech Roma claims for reparations as victims of medical experimentation from in Auschwitz and in Ravensbrück. And in the Czech archives, you'll find parallel documentation from the Auschwitz Commission of the Czechoslovak Union of Gypsies Roma. By the 1970s and 1980s, there were testimony projects that in the 1990s and 2000s became video testimony projects that we're quite familiar with, for example, from the Shoah Foundation. In short, the documentation is pretty standard and pretty ample. It's not hard, in fact, particularly if we think in terms of a perpetrator history, to integrate Roma into the history of the Nazi genocidal project. Christopher Browning, for example, argues that the Nazi genocide should be thought of, and here I'm quoting, as three clusters of genocidal projects: the purification of the German race through the mass murder of the mentally and physically handicapped within the Third Reich, and the expulsion and mass murder of gypsies from the Third Reich. It's one cluster. The second cluster, he argues, was the ethnic restructuring of the occupied areas, particularly in Slavic countries, the decimation and expulsion of the predominantly Slavic populations of what we also know as the Nazi Lebensraum. And the third cluster, he argues, was the systematic and total mass murder of every Jew, known as the Holocaust. Others place Roma and people with disabilities more centrally in the history of the Holocaust. Henry Friedlander, for example, argues that the racial purification project aimed at Roma and people with disabilities gave rise to the Holocaust, and that Roma and the disabled were thus its first victims. We have newer work on the mass murder of Roma on the Eastern Front, and on the persecution and murder of Roma by Nazi allies. And this history gradually will fill in the history of the systematic mass murder of Roma across Europe over the course of the war. But of course, the revolution in the study of the Holocaust over the past 20 years really is the turn to a victim-based history, one that incorporates testimony, memoirs, diaries, in short, the accounts of the victims. One of the most famous formulations of this is Saul Friedlander's call for an integrated history of the Holocaust. And here I'm going to quote at length. So what he says is, simply put, an integrated history of the Holocaust is necessary. First, due to the fact that this history cannot be limited to German decisions and measures only. Right? That we need a history that includes authorities, institutions, and the most diverse social groups throughout the occupied and satellite countries of German-controlled Europe. We need all of the different aspects of a 360 view. Right? Second, he says, owing to the evidence that at each stage, Jewish perceptions and reactions, collective or individual, were an integral part of this history, and thus cannot be considered as a separate domain in relation to any general historical rendition. And then, finally, a simultaneous representation of all of these pieces, right? All of these events at all levels, in all different places, he says, it's a big project, enhances the perception of the magnitude, the complexity, and the interrelatedness of the immense number of components of this history. And here, I think, in Holocaust studies, we have fallen short in integrating the perceptions and reactions of the other victims. In other words, our integrated history is not itself integrated. The historian Ari Yaskovich has taken up this issue in a project he calls, when he refers to the entanglements of Jewish and Romani accounts of the Holocaust. In part, he points out that the testimonies of the Romani Holocaust are commonly filtered through the lens of Jewish survivors or stored in archives dedicated to the Jewish Holocaust. Actually, Jewish institutions and Jewish survivors are critical, actually, in the collection of accounts from Roma in the aftermath of the Holocaust. It is one of the reasons we have any kind of victim-based recording of, victim-based archive of, general archive of the Romani experience. But that means that the sources we use to write the history of Roma in the Holocaust are a product of and inseparable from the asymmetrical relationship between victim groups. Right? So we have an asymmetrical relationship between perpetrators and victims, but within the victim group we have a set of other asymmetrical relationships that we have yet to sort of fully come to grips with. And so if we are to integrate our history of the Holocaust, I think we first have to take up these asymmetries, the question of how the Romani Holocaust has come to be known as unknown, and the labor that the framework does in excluding and marginalizing Roma from the history of the event, not just Roma, and eliding Romani accounts of their experiences, which plays some sort of role in shoring up and normalizing certain other understandings of the event. The Holocaust and Genocide Studies historian Dirk Moses has pointed out a similar structure in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, namely that scholars of other genocides incorporate, I'm quoting again, incorporate the Holocaust into their object of inquiry, whereas the reverse does not hold. Right? That Holocaust historians do not necessarily draw on the history of other genocides to expand their understanding of the Holocaust. And this is perhaps one of the challenges that genocide studies poses for us, scholars of the Holocaust, the reminder that as long as the other victims remain other, then our understanding of the Holocaust itself remains fundamentally incomplete. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a la doctora Krishna por su ponencia. Ahora invitamos al doctor Nils Kremer. El doctor Nils Kremer estudió su maestría en la Universidad de Hamburg y su doctorado en Columbia University. Actualmente es profesor de tiempo completo y director del Centro Ackerman para Estudio del Holocausto en la Universidad de Texas en Dallas, en donde tiene el nombramiento como Stan and Barbara Robin Professor. El doctor Kremer es autor de numerosos artículos y de varios libros, entre los cuales se encuentran Jewish Scholarship and Cultural in 19th Century Germany, Between History and Faith, y The Story of Worms, German Cities, Jewish Memories, además de ser coeditor de varias publicaciones. Actualmente está terminando un libro sobre escritos de viaje de judíos centroeuropeos en el siglo XX. Es miembro del Consejo del Instituto Leo Berg y dictaminador externo de diferentes revistas académicas de prestigio internacional. Su práctica docente ha sido reconocida como innovadora y merecedora del reconocimiento internacional al Centro Ackerman y los programas de la Escuela de Artes y Humanidades en la Universidad de Texas en Dallas. La ponencia que nos va a entender el título que tiene es History and Memory of the Holocaust and Other Genocides. Demos un fuerte abrazo, profesor.
A little crowded here. Good morning. I'll have about 15 minutes, and all in all, want to address 20. No, I can address 4 things. 3 things still it is. A little bit adding on to this question about Holocaust and other genocides, how to differentiate those two, if at all. Secondly, I want to speak a little bit about the changing ideas of victims. I think the backside to all of this, of genocides, is that our understanding of what a victim is has dramatically changed in the 20th century. And then thirdly, I want to speak a little bit about memory.